I'm Rachel Horgan. Join me each episode as I sit down with a guest co-host covering the latest business stories in the Seattle area. We'll read the news so you don't have to. This is The Weekly. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I finished Seafair Festival. As many know, I was the entertainment coordinator, so my vision was to have a music festival within the Seafair Festival, which is more of a boat show and an air show. And I finished it up. It was really, really great and fun and went well. The bands did awesome. It was also cool as an event planner to see the behind the scenes of festival planning. I've done a lot of corporate and a lot of stuff translates, and I've done a lot of on the ground festival work, but to see the behind the scenes of dealing with the city and the general public and all the moving pieces was incredible. So shout out to the Seafair planning team. And it's nice to have a little bit of not free time, I shouldn't say that, less busy time. And then I've got 5 weeks of travel coming up between 2 personal and 3 work because I have a couple other clients. My last thing I'm going to say before I introduce my guest is that that lesbian event that I was talking about, I partnered with a podcast based in Atlanta. We're doing a live show here in Seattle at the Old Century Ballroom, which is now Reverie Ballroom. And that'll be October 18th here in Seattle. And then I've planned a couple other events. I just launched it today, and I feel like I'm so excited, but I'm also like, is it even going to come? And I feel like my guest might relate to some of those feelings. So I'm sitting here with James Robinson, the General and Artistic Director for the Seattle Opera. Hi.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. Do you get that feeling like when your tickets open, or you're nervous about people buying them, or what goes through your mind?
Absolutely. I usually get more nervous about ticket sales 2 weeks before we open a show. So It's like, where are we? Are people going to be here? Mm-hmm. And then I'm always so pleasantly surprised, when I give a pre-performance, hello to the audience and all that stuff. And it's always wonderful when you see a packed house. So that's always great.
Yeah, I've seen with events that more people are buying last minute, which is still great if people show up, but very stressful for the planner.
It is very stressful.
Yeah. Well, I want to say a little bit about you. You took over this position last September, so you're approaching your year mark. Mm-hmm. And prior to this, you were the artistic director at the Opera Theater of St. Louis, where you commissioned 11 world premieres. Mm-hmm. And then before, you have a long history of working as a stage director. So you directed at least 75 new productions at the world's top theaters. So a long history, very impressive. And then something I thought was interesting is that you're the 5th person to lead the Seattle Opera in its 61-year history.
Right.
Is that common to not have very much turnover in leadership in the opera world? That's
pretty common. Most companies I know, the turnover is, people stay in the jobs for 25, 30 years.
Wow.
It's really interesting. So in 61 years, 5th person, well, I guess if you do the math, you think, okay, that's about right. But, honestly, people stay in these jobs for shorter amounts of time these days. I think there's more turnover. I'm not sure why.
Yeah. Maybe kind of how society is moving.
I think so
our
too.
Parents stayed in the same job, and a lot of us don't anymore.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, as I mentioned, you used to be the stage director, and then you moved into leadership. Mm-hmm. What kind of made you make that shift? Because it's obviously pretty different than being on the ground with the play versus managing the entire organization.
Sure. I'm still an active stage director.
Oh, okay. Great.
So, and one thing about coming to Seattle Opera, I think I'm the only general and artistic director that the company's had.
Okay.
And I really believe that in these leadership positions, it's useful to be an active artist. Mm-hmm. So even though I'm doing less and less directing, because at the peak I was doing 8 new productions a year, and that's a lot of shows.
That's a lot.
And now, I do the things that I really want to do. I had committed to doing some things before taking the job in Seattle. These, fortunately, are collaborations that we're doing with Seattle Opera. So I was just in Santa Fe directing a new production of La Boheme, and that's a co-production with Seattle. So it's important to maintain these types of relationships with our peer organizations throughout the United States. But really, I would say most people who have been directors like myself or conductors, we're used to being in leadership positions, even though we're active artists. I think that just goes with the territory,
absolutely,
of running an arts organization.
Yeah, and I firmly believe that when you do I guess I don't want to say lower level, but when you do the work that's on the ground, it makes you such a better leader. When I was working way back when, front desk at a hotel, they had me clean a room with a housekeeper, and I was like, okay, now I know a lot more about kind of that world and how to work within it and how to advocate for them and things like that.
Absolutely. And, I started off, my very first job in opera was as an usher. So, I know a bit about front of house, as they say, but then I was a production assistant, learned a lot about, how things operate backstage and it's a fascinating world, when you kind of, learn the ropes from front of house, backstage, as a director or as an assistant director, whatever. And I think it adds to your own personal and professional portfolio, and you really understand what people go through in organizations. I think it's very useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I have one more question before we get into our stories. And you kind of mentioned that you've grown up a little bit in this industry. What made you get into it in the first place?
Well, my background was actually in music. I studied music composition for a very long time and wanted to originally write music for television commercials.
So specific. Okay.
Very specific.
Little, like jingles?
Yeah, I wanted to do that. I have a dear aunt who was in the advertising business in Chicago, and I was just sort of fascinated by that. But the stuff that I was writing was considered a little too serious. So then somebody said, "Oh, you should write, get into composition, but more, I guess we would say, concert music, symphony, chamber music, stuff like that." And I had a teacher who was an opera composer, Dominic Argento. And one summer I was house sitting for some friends in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I was meant to be working on my master's thesis and got a job as an usher. And then I was just bitten by the bug. And I love the sort of the spectacle of it, the sort of collaborative spirit of putting shows together, because, the work of a composer is a lonely business. So
I can imagine, yeah.
It's like the Maytag repairman.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, definitely. Well, we've got 3 stories today. The first one, I've done this before, but for those that don't know, actually, I learned at the newspaper that summer is a slow time for business news, and it gives me a little bit more freedom of what I want to talk about on these episodes. So the first one, we're going to kind of talk about the business of performance art. I think sometimes people don't think of it as your stereotypical corporation and business, but there's such a huge side that you're dealing with, and we'll dive into that. Then we'll talk about Starbucks making some changes. They're moving away from their pickup-only stores. And lastly, Zillow is being sued. I know you think we've covered that before, and we have, but guess what? They're being sued again. So we'll get into all of it. All right, so the first one is the business of performance art. There's not a specific article per se tied to this, but there was one that came out in April that Puget Sound Business Journal put out that you were featured in and interviewed. They also talked to Bill Barry. He's the executive director of the Fifth Avenue Theater. Scott Stolen, the CEO of Seattle Art Museum, who we will have on later in the year, which is awesome. And then, of course, our guest today, James Robinson. The article was discussing kind of how Seattle area arts orgs are rethinking how they approach their funding and kind of going a little bit away from their traditional sources due to just the climate that we're in. And almost all of them, I think all of them, said that they're not budgeting for federal funding. So James, I want to talk to you obviously about funding and stuff like that, but before we dive into it, give us a sense of the size and scope of the Seattle Opera, whether that's how much revenue, how many shows, how many employees, what's the size of this?
Okay, so we are considered a budget one company in the United States. So our peer organizations would be, say, the LA Opera, San Francisco, Chicago, Houston. The Metropolitan Opera is kind of in its own category because that's such a monstrous organization. But the companies that I mentioned, we're all more or less in the same budget ballpark. We're about a $21 million annual company. Okay. So we rely on a balance of things, obviously. Tickets, sales, that's an important part of what we do. Contributed revenue, meaning the generosity of supporters and people who invest in us, and that's the way we operate. Around $21 million. We have during the year we're doing 4 productions, 3 fully staged productions, 1 concert production. We have a close relationship with the Seattle Symphony. And then, of course, we have stage crew and front of house people.
Is 4 a year like pretty standard with all the other?
Pretty much for where we are budgetarily, yes.
Okay.
Other companies, I think Houston does 6, but their budget is bigger than ours.
Okay.
So anyway, but we have 50 core employees part time. But one thing that's interesting is I'd say any given year between the chorus, the symphony, our stage crew, our staff, all of that, we're employing about 600 people a year.
Oh, wow.
If not more. They're not all full time, like the symphony or stage crew. So we do provide a lot of employment opportunities for folks in the Seattle area. It takes a lot of money to produce opera.
I'm learning. Yeah. Tell me more about that.
It's a big art form. It's a big, wonderful, crazy art form. And a dear friend of mine once said, the only thing more expensive than opera is war. So I'm not sure that's entirely true, but sometimes it feels
the article
close.
said something about it was going to cost $200,000 to ship some of the costumes from somewhere.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about it is we are always at the mercy of the cost of transportation, how much it costs for materials. If we're building a set, for example, where are those materials coming from? For building costumes, I mean, it's a very expensive thing to do. But, by and large, if we're doing a show with chorus, we may have 60 to 75 people on stage for every performance. That's a lot of bodies up there. Plus, the folks in the orchestra pit.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, when we think about funding to pay for this, do you have a sense of percentage? You mentioned some as donors, some tickets, some grants, and we're obviously being affected by the lack of federal funding. How does that break down percentage-wise if you have that information?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think right now, I would say 38% of our income is from ticket sales. Okay, so that's almost 40% of what we do. 56% is contributed revenue. Our donors are, people who invest in us. And then the other two may come from 2%, 3% comes from distribution from an endowment that we have. So we've got an endowment that's worth about $32 million right now, which is fine, but I'd rather see that number a lot higher just so that we could benefit more, from the distribution. So that's how it generally breaks down. The one thing that is quite different for us is that we don't really rely on government funding.
Okay, that was going to be my next question. Has that affected you at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's affected morale more than anything. Sure. We were promised by the NEA a grant for our production of The Magic Flute. Now, Magic Flute is a great opera. It's very family friendly. We did a production that did incredibly well here. We saw, lots of young people, lots of families. It was terrific. So for the NEA to, rip the measly $30,000 away from us, look, and I'm not saying $30,000 is chump change, but let's be honest, it's not a huge amount of money in the grand scheme of things. But it has more to do with, I think, the rather short-sighted and heartless gesture of taking money away that was promised.
Yeah.
So, we have to recoup that. Again, we don't rely so much on federal funding.
Yeah.
I think it's despicable, of course, that something was promised and then
absolutely
reneged on. But so we just have to be more creative about our resources, where they come from, and how we spend money.
Yeah. Well, speaking of being creative, one of the things in there was talking about the difference between single ticket sales versus membership. And if you compare that to sports, I'm guessing it's kind of like a season ticket holder, potentially?
Yeah, we call them subscriptions.
Subscriptions. Okay.
Yeah.
Talk to me about, I guess, have you made changes to that and kind of your strategy around sales like that?
Yeah, sure. Subscription sales used to be the bread and butter of all arts organizations, whether it was, say, a repertory theater company, a symphony, an opera company, and it provided the company working capital. And subscriptions were really a very interesting model because people, really coveted their subscriptions. They were in it. And then things gradually started changing. So subscriptions were falling off in place of single ticket sales. So we are at about 60% of what we would consider our peak of subscriptions. That's in keeping with other arts organizations. So, there's nothing terribly alarming about it. It's not unique to us. But the way people, choose to go out and do things has changed a great deal. a lot of last-minute ticket buyers. People are relying more on what they read about things, word of mouth, and that's just where we are. So our marketing strategies have had to radically change because we just can't rely on people buying a subscription, all of our offerings in the season. And we tailor that, of course. We try to incentivize people.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
If they want to just buy 2 or 3, but it is a single ticket game out there, and that's just all over the country.
What about, I think the opera has a reputation of being like a rich old person's thing.
You can say it.
I know I was hesitating. It's the reputation. I'm not saying it has to be. So how do you combat that? Are you actively trying to get younger people, or is that not the case anymore and it's just still the impression I have?
I think the number one barrier for people coming to the opera is they don't want to feel intimidated or stupid. But the thing I always tell folks is, we have people coming to see things, who want a dress-up experience, and there are people who just want to come because they love the whole idea of it. I always say when you go to the opera, the most important thing is that you should feel it before you think too much about it. And because it's a very visceral experience. We also make it incredibly user-friendly. There are projected super titles, so you always know what the translation is. And we're very audience friendly. So I've also found that having done a lot of new works, a lot of world premieres, a lot of these stories resonate with people today. So if they think they're going to have to go to an opera that's based on some slice of 19th century history, that's not necessarily so.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And it's, when I was in St. Louis, we produced, two examples, an opera by Terence Blanchard based on the boxer Emil Griffith, who was a closeted boxer. And nobody thought that was a weird thing at all. It was like, sure, let's tell this story. And it resulted in a lot of young people, a lot of people who had not normally come to the opera, coming to see it. Commissioned another opera by Terence. It was based on the columnist Charles Blow from the New York Times and his autobiography called Fire Shut Up in My Bones. And again, people just turned out for it, and they loved that. And both of those pieces went on to the Metropolitan Opera. So it's kind of cool when you know,
definitely.
You have to try to find what the entry point is for people coming to the opera. And if it's a new piece, great. But if they've heard of Madame Butterfly or La Boheme, let's make sure that they have a great experience too.
Yeah, I think that's really good to let the people know. And then also, I forgot to mention, we are actually here at the Seattle Opera building. So is this is part of McCall Hall?
We're adjacent to McCall Hall.
Okay.
So this is the Seattle Opera Center, and we're in Tagney Jones Recital Hall.
Yeah, and we've got all these seats. I feel really special, and like I'm on stage, but we're just missing the people.
We're just missing the people.
Okay, so one more question before we move on, which is there anything that you see for the future of the arts organization, or how do you see things changing in the next 5 years?
Yeah. I think arts organizations, particularly performing arts organizations like us, we just have to be a little more savvy about how we're operating. We have to understand that we need to be more aggressive about reaching out, bringing people to us. We also need to show that we have a good business model. I think, unfortunately, a lot of performing arts organizations in general, you can't go hat in hand with a sob story anymore and expect somebody to support you. You have to have a really good business plan. You have to say, we really are small businesses. I mean, look at all the people that we employ, as I said earlier. And it's really, about how we use our resources and soldier those resources. So that has been something new. I use the word investment a lot. We do talk about the generosity of our supporters, our donors, but those folks are really investing not just in Seattle Opera, in this community, they are investing in the community. The one thing that I find a little challenging, and this is not unique to Seattle, but I'll just bring it up anyway. I've noticed that a lot of corporations will, in their recruitment materials, will talk about the great cultural and artistic fabric that
Yeah,
makes up
makes up
Seattle,
Seattle,
and it's to get people to come and work for these great companies. So it's like, okay, we're the arts organizations are investing our limited resources in making things great. I don't see that type of mutual investment happening as aggressively or as, what do I want to say, mutually beneficially as it could. But again, I think it's because maybe our terminology has not been correct. That's why I talk about our donor base as investors, and this is a type of mutual investment.
Right. Not like, hey, can you help me put on this opera? It's going to be really fun, please. Like, it's not that approach. It's like, invest money and it'll return to you in a better Seattle, a better economy,
Absolutely,
a better experience for your employees, all of that. So I think that's really smart.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're going to move on to, we've got two more stories here. So the next one is about Starbucks. So their whole thing with this new CEO is, quote, back to Starbucks. Starbucks used to be kind of this third place. You'd sit down and hang out. And with a lot of the tech, it's just become very transactional. So there's stores, I didn't really know this actually, there's pickup only stores, and they're saying that there's just become too overly transactional. There's no human connection, which I totally agree. And they are still going to be using tech, and they're going to do something called a smart queue, which will help people. If you've done a mobile order, if you come in person, I've gone to a Starbucks where I've been waiting in person. There's nobody in the store, and I'd have to wait for like 20 minutes because there's all these mobile orders that they're making. So I guess they're launching some tech to kind of help with that. This comes after a 6th straight quarter of declining same-store sales. So things are not going well, and I think this is one of their routes of trying something new and different, I guess, which is going back to their old ways. And then a fun fact on here I thought was interesting is that Starbucks was really early to adopt tech, and they launched their own digital wallet long before Apple Pay took off. I kind of forgot about that. So anyway, the article really talks about the importance of customer experience, saying these pickup-only stores are not doing it. We need to do something else. So what, for you, James, is an example of something you've done or that you do to enhance the customer experience when they're coming to Seattle Opera, whether that's big or small?
Okay, sure. I'm going to comment a little bit on my on a recent Starbucks experience.
Please do.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
I noticed in my neighborhood that the Starbucks had changed a little bit. We moved here in September, October. We're up in View Ridge, and the Starbucks near us looked like every other Starbucks. Then gradually, the seats changed. There was less stuff inside. People would, when you'd order something, they'd, make a smiley face on it, or, it was becoming a little more, I don't know, warm and friendly. And that's just, up in my neighborhood. But then I have been to other ones where you are waiting for 20 minutes because there are these crazy mobile orders, and it's like, okay, what is this? And I always thought that was a huge turnoff. So I actually prefer to go to smaller coffee places. Nothing against Starbucks, but it's just, losing that personal touch has really caught up with them. Now, how does that relate to opera and the Seattle Opera? I like to think that we are in the business of providing the best entire experience. So the minute people decide to buy a ticket, we want to make sure that they have contact, as much contact as they want. We're not burdening people with unnecessary phone calls, but we want to make sure that it's easy to get a ticket. If they want to exchange a ticket, they can talk to somebody. They can, all that stuff is very user friendly. They come to the theater. They are greeted with very enthusiastic, welcoming people who will provide as much information. Which
I would argue is one of the most important pieces of an event experience is you're the very first person that greet you. And that's why valet is so important.
Absolutely. Yes, You're absolutely right. You're right. And, if people have any questions, staff members, they're ready to help. We actually have some of our board members who are ambassadors who will just go up and start talking to people if they look like they might have a question. Just showing folks around. It's so important to make sure that it's a really good experience. And I say we do a pretty darn good job of making sure that the experience from beginning to end has a real human touch to it.
I was just going to say, how do you balance kind of the rise of both tech but also ease with that human connection. I'll give an example. In the event world, at big conferences, there's these like self check-in kiosks. Now you just put in your last name and it'll print out your badge. You don't have to talk to anybody. Or in the hotel world, it's go on the app and check out or check in. You don't have to talk to anybody and you get a virtual key, all this stuff that's trying to make people's lives easier. And I have such a hard time with it because I don't want to, like, I would, as a planner, I want somebody to be like, hey, how was your flight in? Here's your badge. Get excited for the party tonight, all of that. So I don't know, talk to me. Have you had to make some of those decisions between ease and you leaning into tech versus the human part of it?
Well, we're always going to study advances that might just make things easier, mostly for people to get a ticket. How are they going to get to the opera? How are they going to park? I mean, we have a system where they can buy parking online when they buy their ticket, all of that stuff. We give them as much information as possible. But, I'm like, when I check into a hotel, I had an experience a few days ago where I kept getting these text messages from a hotel that I had stayed at before saying, please check in. And I was like, what? And it seemed so impersonal. So I did it, and then I get to the hotel, and they have all the information, and just to get my key card, took about 5 seconds. And I have to say, I really missed just sort of chatting to with somebody. And I'm sure there are people who don't want too much, personal contact, but I believe that it's vital. I mean, I miss it when it's not there. I feel that we seem to be longing more and more for that personal connection, even if it's, checking in or, or whatever. I think maybe we've gone a little too far.
Yeah. And maybe people don't realize that they need or want it.
I think
because
you're
we're
right.
like, oh, cool, mobile ordering or checking on my phone. That sounds great. But then why am I not having a good time at this event? You know what I mean? Like they may not know that that's what it is.
If it starts off remotely, and I don't mean remote like you're in another location, but there is this sense of detachment or whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
I think that can continue throughout the entire experience. So
yeah. All right, we're going to move on to the last article of the episode, which is CoStar is suing Zillow over copyright infringement. So Virginia-based real estate company CoStar suing Zillow, alleging that Zillow used almost 50,000 CoStar copyrighted photos. And they're saying that they cropped out the watermark. The article is saying basically if you click on the image, it gets larger and then you can see the watermark, but they purposely kind of made it so you can't see it. Allegedly. Zillow has partnered with Redfin and Realtor.com. We've covered that in other episodes. And CoStar is saying, well, we're going to sue you next if you don't take this stuff down. And then, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, this comes after Compass is already suing Zillow. So the arts world is no stranger to copyright issues, I would think. So how does the Seattle Opera approach things like the digital rights or performance recordings? Like I'm sure you don't allow phones in there, but with social media, I guess how does it show up in your world?
Well, we have pretty strict agreements with our unions. So the musicians union, sorry. Maybe the magicians union too, I don't know.
Yeah, right.
The chorus, they all have different CBAs, different agreements. A lot of it is to protect electronic rights, broadcast rights, things like that. Okay, so that's a kind of a different thing. However, increasingly we use video projections, animation, depends on what it is for a certain production. So we have to clear all those images. There are two companies that generally where you have a broad licensing agreement. Could be Shutterstock, could be Getty Images. I have been, not here in Seattle, but I have been in a situation where we thought we had clearance for an image. It turned out that it wasn't either of those companies I mentioned. We had to track down the image.
Like the original photographer, creator, or whatever.
Yeah, and it was very hard because it was like in Slovenia, and we liked this image so much. And somebody said, oh, why don't you just get AI to recreate it, but make it different enough? And I felt like, well, that wasn't quite fair. Anyway, so we tracked this person down and had to pay for that. All that means is that we're very diligent about any images that we use, and we make sure that things are cleared. I think generally if we use musical excerpts of things for promotional purposes, we can use a certain amount
like
of
certain
time.
length, right? Yeah.
And sometimes with recording companies, if they have things out there, we get through all of that. But it's a big thing, you know. And like I said, one of the things that's encroaching on all of this is, you know, the AI thing where you can get something pretty darn close that doesn't really capture the whole thing, but you might be out of the woods in terms of a copyright violation.
Yeah.
But maybe you still run the risk of legal exposure. So it's a tricky business, that.
Yeah, well, speaking of AI, how has that come into play? I know people are talking about how AI is writing screenplays now, and have you seen it being used in a creative way? And what do you feel about that?
You know, I'm not going to be the person who is such a purist to say there is no use for this in our world, the world of live performance. I just don't know whether I've seen it applied in a convincing way.
Yeah.
Everything still feels very, you know, experimental. It's sort of early stages. But that's because what we do, it's, you know, I for example, I haven't experienced an opera that was written by an AI program, but, you know.
Right, yeah.
You know,
I would hope not, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard little bits and pieces that were like, oh, well, that's almost convincing because it sounds a bit like Mozart or it sounds like Puccini. But, you know, I think we use AI for certain things. Like if we do a Google search about something, we're going to get, you know, usually the first thing comes up is an AI generated answer to your question. You know, sometimes when we're looking for imagery, like I said, our two main sources, Shutterstock or Getty, increasingly one has to be careful because these AI generated images will come up. And I think people say, oh, well, that looks, you know, AI generated. Is it? Like, maybe, I don't know, you know, so it's tricky.
It's only going to get trickier, I think.
It's going to get trickier, so.
One more thing on this, and I talked about it with a professor at Cornish College of the Arts, and kind of just this idea of owning an idea or owning a performance. And I'm curious if in your time, you know, have two people come up with the same idea, or I think you see this in stand-up comedy a lot of, oh, they stole this person's joke, and it's like, okay, or two people had the same idea at the same time. How do you kind of approach that when you're coming up, probably especially with more of like a new opera?
Yeah, I have seen that where I haven't been involved in this personally, but I have been around situations where two people had an idea about the same thing. And in both these situations, they didn't have to clear the rights. So the material was in the public domain, so they didn't have to do that. Nevertheless, it was a little tricky because, you know, it was like, who's going to get there first? And what ultimately happened is neither of these things were very good. And, you know, so there's an opportunity out there for somebody to approach it anew and make it better. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing to think about. All right, James, we're going to close out the episode with my final question, which is help us be motivated. If we got listeners listening, what's something you do when you really don't want to do your job? What gets you up and going?
What gets me up? Well, I have to say, lately, the thing that gets me up doing my job and out the door is this spectacular Seattle weather that we have in the summertime. Yeah. You know, people had said to me, you know, you put up with a lot in order to enjoy the summertime. They were not kidding. So
that's right, because this is your 1 year. Yeah,
okay. I know. And so I am outside as much as I can be. And in the morning, I'm a pretty early riser. So my coffee, my sitting out on the back deck and kind of collecting my thoughts for an hour, it is one of the best things. And I always find the energy and motivation to get going. And, you know, you just look at this beautiful, you know, city, this part of the world that we're in. And I find that quite motivating. So.
Yeah, very well said. And I like that idea of kind of getting up early, having your coffee, and just kind of taking in the warm weather here in Seattle. So, all right, well, thank you so much for sitting down with me, and thank you for hosting in this beautiful theater. I'm excited. I've not been to the opera, but I'm excited. I will be going this year.
We're going to get you there.
Well, yes, let's do it. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.
This has been The Weekly, with production assistance from Nick Patry. If you liked what you heard, rate us and write a review on Apple Podcast or Spotify. We love listener feedback, so if you have any story suggestions, comments, or complaints, email us at info@theweeklyseattle.com. Make sure to check back next Sunday for the latest local business news. We'll see you next time.